Who has joined us here in the press club, thank you so much, as well as anyone who is joining us virtually online. Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. My name is Emily Wilkins. I'm the membership secretary for the National Press Club and a congressional reporter with Bloomberg Government. Thank you again so much for joining us today for our in-person Headliners book event with Robert Costa, a Washington Post reporter since 2014 and co-author of the book Peril with Bob Woodward. Based on more than 200 interviews and meticulous details, Peril is a deep dive into the Trump presidency in its final years and the rocky transition of power to the Biden administration. In pursuit of details, they discovered that Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, had twice called his Chinese counterpart to tell him not to worry about U.S. stability under Trump. Milley's second call occurred days after the January 6th storming of the Capitol by a pro-Trump mob. Milley also spoke with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi about invoking the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office as concerns rose about Trump's mental state. Costa and Woodward also documented that the January 6th insurrection was not something that Trump passively watched. It was a, quote, concerted effort by the president, by his advisors, by his outside allies like Steve Bannon, to force a reckoning on January 6th to try to decertify President-elect Biden, at the time, his victory from being certified in Congress, Costa said in September. We are delighted to have Robert Costa here with us today and happy to accept your questions. We will ask as many questions as time permits. To submit a question, email headliners, that's headliners plural, at press.org, org, not .com, and please put Costa, C-O-S-T-A, in the subject line. Just so you all know, I get the questions on my phone, so if you see me rudely looking at it while Bob is talking, that's what I'm doing. Let's see here. Robert Costa, or Bob Costa, because Bob Woodward's not here, so we don't have to confuse the two.
When we were writing the book, we'd call each other by our surnames so we didn't get confused.
He's steeped in journalism as a national political reporter for the Washington Post, a political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, and the former moderator and managing editor of Washington Week on PBS. Incredibly impressive resume.
Well, that's very generous. It's great to be here with you.
Good to meet you.
Round of applause for our moderator.
All right, we got a few more things we're going to run through in this intro, which Ellen Ferguson did a great job writing, so I gotta give her credit. One thing I really do want to note that I thought this was important, when you were at the National Review and you began reporting and studying Donald Trump, it gave you a strong sense of him so that when you spoke to Trump in early 2015, you knew that he was going to run for president and you reported that. At the time, a lot of people dismissed Trump as the sideshow. He wasn't given a lot of credit. People didn't think that he could win. But Bob told Brian Lamb in a 2015 interview that his study of US politics convinced him that Trump's message, delivered as an outsider, as a celebrity, as someone not beholden to elites, would strike a chord with the public. And after his work on Peril, Costa says, I'm just going to switch it to Bob. Bob says he is certain that Trump will run for the presidency in 2024 for vengeance. You recently told MSNBC, we're just trying to put a mirror up to what happened so people understand some of these contradictions and the strangeness of the situation, but this is American history unfolding before our eyes. We have to pay attention. Bob was born in Richmond, Virginia, but grew up in Yardley, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a super interesting congressional district.
It is.
In a 2019 interview, he said that as a kid, he was deeply influenced by the movie All the President's Men, which obviously tracked the reporting of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Bob spent his middle school years in London after his father, a lawyer, moved the family to England. He credits Miss Zwick, his 8th grade teacher, for developing his love of 20th century history and journalism. Bob said she taught him to, quote, think big and think hard. Once again, please welcome Bob Costa and give him an early birthday wish.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I don't know if I can say how old you're turning.
I'm almost 36 years old.
On October 14th.
Another one of my favorite movies growing up was The Godfather from the 1970s. I'm glad I went in this direction, my other favorite 70s movie for my career, All the President's Men.
And I do have to congratulate you one further. I checked the New York Times bestseller list last night. Peril is not only the top hardcover nonfiction, but is also the top print and ebook nonfiction right now on the New York Times bestseller list. Bob, huge congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thanks for buying it. Thank you for buying it.
All right. So I wanted to start off with just the title of the book itself. It's obviously called Peril. Number one, just how did you get about choosing that name? And number two, it seems to apply a little bit to January 6th. Is our country still in peril?
Well, it's great to be with you here, Emily, and to be back at the National Press Club. I'm a member of the National Press Club, and we've missed these in-person events, so thanks for hosting us and hosting me. And when you think about the title, when Bob Woodward and I were thinking through this book, we were watching President Biden's inaugural address on January 20th, 2021, and you might remember he used the phrase winter of peril. And it was a reference to the transition period from the cold, dangerous transition period in January of 2021. But that title, Peril, may come from Biden's inaugural address, but peril persists in so many ways. The peril of the winter has become the peril of the spring and the summer and now the fall. President Trump may be a former president, but he is out there on the campaign trail activating Republicans nationwide alongside his allies like Steve Bannon to try to make sure Republicans who are allied with him are running for election positions in various states, in municipalities. They want to have a bigger say over what happens in 2022 and 2024. But the peril also persists for President Biden, dealing with the challenges of Afghanistan and the economy, an ongoing pandemic. I appreciate you all making the journey here. Despite that, we're all doing our best. And right now, President Biden's spending plan is on the rocks on Capitol Hill. And so the peril on all these fronts persists. But really the bigger picture of our title is not so much about Biden or Trump. It's about the peril facing American democracy. And what we found as reporters is a lingering question as we finish this. Peril does remain, and can American democracy remain as we've long engaged with it and known it? And that is an open question.
And I think it's one that you really start off defining the stakes of early on in your book. I mean, you begin the book with General Mark Milley and that call, those two calls to his Chinese counterpart. And I'm wondering, in doing that, are you trying, or how close did the U.S. come to having some sort of major security incident? Something, obviously, January 6th was incredibly serious with the Capitol, but do you feel like the U.S. came much closer to potentially having something bigger with a more worldwide implication to it?
Well, when we began this project in December of 2020, we had no idea there would be an insurrection at the United States Capitol on January 6th. And when that happened, we watched it just like all of you. We were in our offices, and I remember getting a chill down my spine as I watched it. Like you, Emily works in the Capitol as a reporter. I've been a reporter for over 10 years covering Capitol Hill. And to see that building, that citadel of American democracy physically attacked, and Capitol police officers physically attacked, was brutal to watch, chilling. And as we watched it, like everyone else, we thought this was the ultimate domestic political crisis. But we had the benefit of what Woodward calls the luxury of time, which is, while the story moved on, we went back and back and back, talking to people involved, aware of what was really going on. And we found two very disturbing things as reporters. One, what we had thought on the surface, and maybe even in total, was a domestic political crisis, was actually a national security emergency. That what happens in the United States does not happen in a vacuum. The world is watching, adversaries and allies. They were watching very closely on January the 6th. And on January the 8th, 2021, two moments for history happened that had not been revealed, and it took us months to report this out. That General Milley calls the Chinese general, General Li, the head of the People's Liberation Army, and the head of the Chinese military is asking the senior officer of the United States military, is the U.S. collapsing? What is going on? And they're starting to really worry, if the U.S. is unstable, what does that mean for China? And Millie recognizes in that moment, based on our reporting, that we are already in a hair-trigger moment in the South China Sea. You see it even this past weekend with the Chinese flying military planes over Taiwan. And that it's not about President Trump wanting war with China. In fact, it's spelled out in our book. Millie did not believe Trump wanted war. What Millie was concerned about, and others were concerned about, including the CIA Director Gina Haspel, was that miscommunication can be the seeds of war. And avoiding miscommunication with the Chinese was a paramount priority for General Milley and others. So he has to calm down the Chinese. And he had known the Chinese were on the edge of their seat going back to at least October, 4 days before the election, when he had to speak to General Lee before and calm him down again that Trump wasn't going to launch a wag-the-dog attack. Because U.S. intelligence showed that based on media reports in Asia and the Chinese perception of U.S. events, that Trump's tough rhetoric on China, among other moves in the South China Sea, had made the Chinese fear maybe an attack was coming from Trump, even though it was not. So we were in an environment, as we all watched January 6th, not knowing how much alarm was going on behind the scenes. And another thing that stands with us as reporters is you think about, you know things, but you don't know things. It was reported on January 8th that Millie speaks with Speaker Pelosi, and she inquired about the nuclear arsenal and making sure things were under control. And that was reported, and it passed in about a day. But as you see in the beginning of Peril, we found a transcript through our reporting of this call, and you see the alarm, you hear it in the speaker's voice as you read the transcript. And Speaker Pelosi is not some new person to the speakership. This is someone who has spent decades in Congress, has been on the Intelligence Committee, and she's highly aware that our whole system on nuclear weapons is complicated, but it really comes down to one thing, the commander-in-chief. And there's a new op-ed right now in the Wall Street Journal, just posted an hour ago from Bill Perry, about how the U.S. nuclear arsenal needs to be reevaluated. And we've already seen, based on our book, a lot of new discussion of, does the president have too much power when it comes to nuclear weapons? And that's another lingering question after this book, because what we saw throughout our reporting is the presidency as an institution over the last century has amassed so much power. And that Donald Trump, when he came in, may have been an outsider, may have been unfamiliar with how to use it, but by the end, he was very familiar with how to pull the levers of power. And that ultimate lever is the nuclear button.
I also wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, about the presidential power, because that's something I cover Congress as well. That's something that Democrats have not only discussed under President Trump, they're still discussing it under President Biden. They have a package of policies, a legislation that would limit pardon power, strengthen the ability of Congress to enforce subpoenas, protect whistleblowers, bolster interagency watchdogs. I mean, you've also mentioned stuff with the nuclear codes. How critical is it that Congress find a way to pass this legislation before the next election? And if they don't, what's the worst case scenario?
Well, one of the biggest issues that came up during our reporting is the role of Congress. Has Congress, to the point I just made, been diminished in the American system? You see a presidency in Donald Trump, and even now to an extent with President Biden, and we saw it with President Obama and others, this move away from legislation and toward executive orders. That the executive branch is not only expanding in terms of departments, but it's expanding in terms of its power across the board. And Congress wants a say in so many of these issues. But because Congress is so deeply divided, whether it's infrastructure now or it's national security policy, consensus isn't there. And the lack of consensus means Congress is effectively sclerotic politically and legislatively. And that diminishes its power in this system. And when Congress can't move on legislation, who steps into the void? The executive branch, the presidency, or at times the courts. And so one of the issues we're all tracking as reporters is, can Congress ever revive itself as an equal branch?
Absolutely. And I mean, as you point out, it always seems like there's something else that's a priority because Congress wants to focus on things that are going to move voters. Talking about infrastructure, talking about healthcare, that moves voters. talking about Article 1 powers and subpoena powers is not something that really gets a lot of Americans out into the polls. But what could be the worst case scenario if Congress continues to not prioritize this and to prioritize other things? I mean, what's the worst case scenario here for a president that has a power that far exceeds what the founders initially planned for the executive branch?
Well, we need to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th. We've done as much as we could over the last 9 months to dig, and confirm and put it in this book. This book was written to the absolute last moment in the summer, published very quickly, rushed out almost, thanks to Simon & Schuster realizing the importance of getting this out. But with the House Select Committee on January 6th, we still have a lot of questions about whether people who were around President Trump, what were they doing? And our book, in part, was cited in these recent subpoenas that were issued by the committee. They cite Peril in the subpoena for Steve Bannon and for Dan Scavino, a former advisor to President Trump. And what they cite in the subpoenas are scenes from our book that show them talking to President Trump in the days before January 6th. And to your point, what's the worst case scenario? I'm not here to take any kind of editorial or political stand, but the worst case for citizens and for reporters is not knowing the truth. What is the truth of what happened in this country? We had an insurrection on Capitol Hill. It seemed at first to be a sporadic rally that led to a riot at the Capitol. But as the New York Times editorial board wrote in a major editorial yesterday, on Sunday, the real story of January 6th was perhaps far darker than we previously knew and understood, because what was happening in the days before January 6th is as important as what happened on the 6th. President Trump, the collective conventional wisdom on Trump so far, on January 6th itself, is that he's in the dining room at the Oval Office, idly watching television. And we have that scene in our book. General Keith Kellogg comes in to talk to the president, says the vice president's okay at the Capitol, we need you to issue this tweet, and the president shrugs him off, says something like, yeah, thanks. That's it. And so that Trump idleness was the snapshot we all knew from the early reporting. But what we show in this book is that Trump was anything but idle. He was enlisting the conservative lawyer John Eastman to directly pressure the vice president in the Oval Office on January 4th, and we document that scene. Trump, the commander-in-chief, urgently telling his vice president 2 days before the insurrection, listen to John, listen to Eastman. I can't do it, Mr. President. We're listening. Listen to Eastman. And what we discovered is that it wasn't just chit-chat about listening to Eastman. Eastman had a 6-point plan about how to throw out electors, throw out millions of votes from the count, prevent Biden from hitting 270, throwing it to the House of Representatives. And what happens when it goes to the House of Representatives? It's not a simple majority vote. It's a vote that's taken by congressional delegations, as spelled out in our Constitution. And in that scenario, Donald Trump could win re-election because Republicans have a majority of delegations at the time. It's a roundabout way to keep power, but it was a way that was being articulated and documented. As someone reported earlier this morning about our book for Salon, they said what's amazing about all of this is it was memorialized in writing. So we were able to find what was memorialized in writing by John Eastman. But the worst case scenario is what else was going on? There needs to be more accountability on all sides, but especially with January 6th, so we can get, as Brad Bradley used to tell Bob Woodward, he would tell me this throughout the writing process, our whole goal with this project is to get the most obtainable version of the truth. We can't always get the whole truth at any time, but you want to get the most obtainable version. We did it, the most obtainable version we could here, but there's always more truth to pursue.
Which is a great jumping off point for the next thing I want to ask you, which is you have already alluded to the January 6th commission that's been established by Congress to look into the day. Your book, I think, does a lot as showing who was behind the scenes, who did what, because at this point, a lot of the reporting really has focused on why wasn't the National Guard called in sooner, who should have given that order, but there's this whole backstory to it that Peril really touches on. I mean, if you could sit down with the members on the January 6th committee and say, these are the questions that we don't know yet. these are the things that Bob Woodward and I tried to get at, but we just don't know enough. What are the remaining questions for January 6th that the committee needs to look into?
Well, I'm not here to give any advice to any sitting member of Congress, but I would step back and offer this. Whether you're an investigator in Congress or you're a reader or a citizen who's active in following civic affairs, I would urge you to rethink how you conceptualize power in America. For over 10 years, I've been covering political movements in the United States. And the two things I always think about, well, the one thing I really think about is assume nothing. Those are the words above my computer on my desk. Because you can't assume anything anymore about American politics. In 2014, I was on the HBO real-time Bill Maher show, which will actually be on this Friday if you want to watch it. But Bill Maher and I had a discussion, because who was on the panel with me in 2014? Bernie Sanders. No one took him seriously. I got to know him. I covered his entire 2016 campaign. The left is churning. Progressive politics are moving. The Democratic Party is changing. In 2011, I got to know Donald Trump. 2014, 2015, I started to interview him all the time. Take these movements seriously. Someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Congress person from New York, she deserves attention for more than what she's wearing to a gala. She could be president of the United States. Take it seriously, whether someone's on the left or the right. Don't just assume that these people are going nowhere, they're not serious. Bob Woodward and I interviewed Trump together on March 31st, 2016 for the Washington Post for over 90 minutes. And Woodward said to me before we go in, this guy could win, let's ask him the governing questions. And so when we look ahead, what was your question again?
January 6th Commission.
Oh, right.
What else do they need to find out?
My point, it's been a long week. I appreciate it. But,
it's Monday.
So the thing I always come back to about the January 6th Commission is when we cover politics on Capitol Hill, we think about power in terms of Kevin McCarthy and McConnell on the Republican side, and Leader Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, on the other side. Official positions. But to the point I was just making about Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, suppose, and you can reconceptualize this, power is different now in America, that people on the outside, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, who are in the ears of a president like Donald Trump, have as much power, perhaps even more at times, than someone like Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy. And that, to me, as I spent months working on this with Bob Woodward, became apparent that when Steve Bannon talks to Donald Trump on December 30th, 2020, and says, you need to get Pence off the expletive ski slopes. Pence was having vacation in Colorado, and you got to get back here. Donald Trump cancels his plans for a New Year's Eve party at Mar-a-Lago and comes back to Washington on the morning of December 31st. Donald Trump loves that New Year's Eve party at Mar-a-Lago. That's the whole reason he stays there through the end of the year. He skipped it, in part after that conversation with Steve Bannon. You see Bannon and others around Trump, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, all in the president's ear. And if you're the January 6th committee or you're someone else, it's power right now in the Republican Party in particular is not just by those who are in positions of power. It's the people on the outside. And the Trump movement continues. Leader McConnell in her book says Trump's a fading brand, and to McConnell he might well be, and to many in Washington he seems like he's a fading brand. But look at these rallies he's holding. Bob Woodward and I often joke with each other, you got to watch the rallies even now. A lot of people say, I'm done with Trump, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to think about it. But he's out there talking to tens of thousands of people throughout the summer saying, I will never surrender, I will never give in, we should never give in, the election was stolen, I want it back. And Brad Parscale, his former campaign manager, says in the summer of 2021 privately to others that if Trump runs again, he wants an army back. That's the phrase, an army for Trump. He had it and he wants it back. And if he runs again, it will be for vengeance.
And I'm going to get into that in just a minute. But before I do, I actually want to backtrack because you were talking for a hot second there about President Biden and progressives. And obviously your book, we've all focused on Trump. I think some of the most newsiest bits have been around Trump and January 6th. But your book also talks about Biden, about how he decided to run, about the campaign that he had. And right now we're really looking at this very critical moment within Biden's presidency as he tries to pass his signature policy package, the infrastructure, the social spending, the taxes on the rich and the wealthy. And I'm wondering, you are someone who has observed politics so closely for the last 10 years. How is Biden sort of addressing the fact that the Democratic Party has changed dramatically from not even just the last time, when he started politics, but really, from his time as vice president?
The Biden story to me is as compelling as the Trump story. I know it hasn't gotten as many headlines, but we really went deep on Biden and why he decided to run and who he is right now as president. And in brief, I would say that 10 years ago when I first started covering Biden, he was vice president of the United States. And I used to stand outside Mitch McConnell's office on the second floor of the Capitol, and Biden, as vice president, would come over in 2011 and 2012 to cut deals with Mitch McConnell. He was the deal maker for Obama. President Obama didn't love working with McConnell. It was pretty obvious. So he would deputize Biden to go over. And you remember those big fiscal cliffs of 2011, 12, and 13? It was Biden cutting the deal oftentimes with McConnell. And Biden was known then as a man who had run for president in 1988, 2008, failed both times, centrist Joe Biden, hawkish Joe Biden, the Amtrak rioting Joe Biden. That was the political persona that he had settled into, that most people knew him by. But what our book shows is that when he decides to run, sparked by the white supremacist march in Charlottesville in 2017, he has this winding path to a decision where it's not so much about ambition, though of course ambition is part of it. He sees his run in 2020 as a mission. He tells Ron Klain, his future chief of staff, as he decides to run in early 2019, that Trump's an un-American president. This is different than the Joe Biden running to be a kind of Kennedy-esque figure in '88. This is a Biden at the end of his career, where he very well could go into political winter and retirement, trying to figure out why he should come back. And many in the party, even some of his aides, said, "You're too old. This is not your time." But he believed he was the one who could beat Trump. He was the person who could say to the country, "I'm a steady hand to beat Trump." It was all about Trump. And while everyone else in the Democratic Party seemed to be debating Medicare for all, Biden was beating the Trump drum.
But that's the interesting thing, right? I mean, Biden was the one to beat Trump, but now he has to lead. He now is the president, and he now has a policy package that, as we saw last week, is still on very rocky ground, still a lot of divisions within the Democratic Party. Is Biden going to be able to pull everyone together and actually pass this?
It's fascinating to see the choices Biden has made as president. And the early part of Biden's presidency is dominated by his $1.9 trillion rescue package, and we document that in the book in detail. And that moment, you probably like that because it's very detailed. Some reviews had said it's perhaps too detailed, which I understand. But it's important to see Biden operating as president, because he's president now. And what you see with Biden is not the centrist Amtrak Joe. You see a Biden who looks up at a picture, a portrait of FDR on the wall in the Oval Office and says, "That's where we're at. I want to be a transformational, progressive president." And he's guided by Ron Klain, a chief of staff who agrees with that approach to the Biden presidency, that this is not going to be the deal cutter, at least at this moment. And the scenes with McConnell in our book, McConnell's watching all of this early on in the Biden presidency and saying, Joe Biden will deal with him when he comes to us, because right now he's doing his own thing. And we've seen since day one in the Biden presidency a push to go big. $1.9 trillion early on. Now more than $3 trillion on the table for infrastructure and other social spending. This is not the Biden from 2011 coming over to cut the fiscal deal. Look at even President Biden's comments this morning, making no assurances about the debt ceiling. This debate, negotiation is clearly going to the brink. You're covering it far more closely than anyone else in this room. And Biden is determined to hold his ground as a progressive. And he sees that this is the moment where you have political capital early in a presidency, year one. And what makes Biden interesting to me as a reporter is whereas Trump was the ultimate outsider, Biden's the ultimate insider. And he has sought the presidency for years, He has been in the Senate since January of 1973, so he has watched presidents. In fact, he was the first member of the Senate ever to endorse Jimmy Carter. That's how far back Biden goes. So he has watched presidents struggle in year one, including Obama. And a lot of his presidency can be traced back to experiences that have seared him or informed him in the past.
So yes or no, do you think he's going to pass his policy package?
I think the Democratic majorities are so narrow that I don't want to predict, but passing them wholesale may be quite difficult as long as Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema hold their ground. But at the end of the day, ahead of 2022, both the House Progressive Caucus, led by Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and Manchin and Sinema do have shared interests to a point. They may not want to combine everything into a composite piece of legislation, but they all, as Democrats, whether they're centrist or progressive, want to have something they can tout for the 2022 midterms. So based on my reporting for the book, it's clear that just like with the rescue plan, it took to the absolute last minute. Something's likely going to happen here. Whether it's broken up or not, I'm not sure. I'm not tracking it that closely. But as you see in our book, so much of politics now in a base-driven political culture is about both sides, from the speakership to the presidency on down to backbenchers, about holding on to the last possible moment so they can make the case to their base voters that they did not blink. So much is about assuring the base voter that you have not blinked. And that's what we're seeing now, a stare down, but ultimately they do have shared interest to get something done.
I do want to move a little bit to the 2024 elections. I think and maybe the best place to start is the 2022 elections, as that's coming up first. You have multiple instances in your book of lawmakers, officials who realize that Trump lost the election. They accept that Trump lost the election. And they're trying to sort of gingerly find a way to talk to Trump about this. And you said on MSNBC that the reason that so many of Trump advisors and White House officials did not call him out on his lies is because Trump has enormous political capital. And I'm wondering, this is a man who has now lost a presidential election, assisted in helping the Republicans lose the Senate, has helped spark an insurrection, and has really, even though he might have strengthened his position with his base, has isolated a lot of more mainstream Republicans and independents. And so I'm wondering, I guess, this political capital that these mainstream Republicans were afraid of, does that still exist? Has that diminished because of the events of January?
There's a total divide in the GOP about that. On one level, Senator Lindsey Graham is trying to rehabilitate President Trump constantly, playing golf with him down in Florida and elsewhere, saying, we got to get you back. Come back. You got to rethink, put aside your election grievances. I want you to be the leader. Someone like Leader McConnell is not doing that. He in his Kentucky way, he's privately said, President Trump is like an off-the-track thoroughbred, someone we should just leave alone, not let come back. But to your point about the president's and the election and how he handled it, one scene in the book that I think deserves more attention is when Trump is talking to Kellyanne Conway in the days after the election. And it's really important what he says privately in the days after. He says to her, how did we lose to Joe Biden? How did that happen? How did this happen? I can't believe we lost to this guy. So what is in that discussion? An acknowledgement of defeat. And this is around November 5th and 6th. So privately, we report, Trump does talk about being defeated by Biden. But it's around November 6th and 7th of 2020. And as Woodward always tells me, chronology is everything. Around the 6th and 7th, Giuliani pops into the picture. And others start popping into the president's orbit. And they're saying, it was stolen. And Trump takes that and says, that's now my refrain. That's the refrain I'll use. But for a day or two, he, like others around him, was in shock and seemed to acknowledge defeat. And one scene that also hasn't gotten much attention but sticks with me is a few days after the election, Hope Hicks, his longtime aide, comes in to see him in the Oval Office. And she says, you can go back to Mar-a-Lago and be the king of the GOP, run it all from Palm Beach. And he says to her, Hope, you don't get it. I can't concede. My people demand I fight. She said, you have everything ahead of you. Speaking gigs, TV shows, everything you want. Hope you don't understand. My people demand I fight. I must fight. That's what they want. That's who I am. That's what I'm all about.
This seems to be a theme with Trump, because even earlier in the 2020 campaign, he is told explicitly by his advisors, you know, you've got your base is solid, you need to go after the independent voters and the moderate Republicans. But Trump, once again, just focuses on his base. If he runs again, is that sort of intense focus on the base going to wind up costing him the larger election?
Many of his advisors think his focus on the base is a disastrous play for 2024. But as Bill Barr, the Attorney General, who also acted as a political advisor to President Trump, said to the President in April of 2020, it's quite a scene, he goes in to see the President and he says to the President, you think you are an expletive genius politically, and your voters, even those who love you, think you're an expletive. But Trump doesn't listen to Barr. Now, we'll put aside for a second the fact that the Attorney General is advising the President on political strategy, but that definitely happened. And Barr had a similar conversation with George H.W. Bush when he was Attorney General for Bush back in 1992, that you're losing the whole point of the election. And years later, he has a similar conversation with Trump, albeit with far more curse words. But you see the President unable, Trump, to move away from his base, but more importantly, can't move on from his grievances about the election. And he believes the base is the key to his power to come back. And he might be right. We have a scene in the book at the end. John McLaughlin, the New York pollster, is close to Trump, is telling him voters in the Republican Party have never loved you more. The presidency, the Republican nomination, it's there for you on a platter if you want to pluck it up again. And the polling bears it out, according to Trump's advisors. So even though Trump lost, he doesn't see a path back to the center as viable, and this has consequences across the board for our country.
I'm wondering, too, if Trump is going to run again in 2024 based off vengeance. I mean, his message in 2016, one that you noted would resound with voters, was, hey, I'm the outsider, you've been forgotten, I will stand up for you. And that resounded, that worked, that brought him to the presidency. Is a message of vengeance, or a message that is underlined by vengeance, going to resound with voters? And I know I'm asking you to predict a little bit further out in 2024, but let's be real, the presidential election begins in 2023. So 2 years from now, do you think a message of vengeance is going to resound with a large number of Americans?
Well, it's resounding with Trump voters right now. I mean, I watch these rallies. I know some of you are exhausted by them, but when they're on C-SPAN, and he's in Ohio or Alabama over the course of the summer of 2021, and you watch, he speaks for 90 minutes or 2 hours. This is someone who's out there with a warlike cadence, and he's saying, we will never surrender, we will never give in, the election was stolen, I want back. That's who Trump is right now. He's not articulating a policy agenda. He's not saying Biden is doing X, Y, and Z. He's very critical of Biden on Afghanistan for the withdrawal and how it was done. But as our book shows, even on that policy, it's very complicated. President Trump in November of 2020 issued a memorandum that he signed outside of the usual channels to withdraw U.S. troops hastily from Afghanistan without even going through the U.S. military. So on Afghanistan, his own record is complicated in making the case against President Biden. And on immigration, he certainly has a different argument than Biden. That's going to be part of it. You see him doing that privately. But so much of Trump, having covered him for years, is about Trump. And that's not surprising, but that's what it is to this day. He's someone who took over the Republican Party and has used the Republican Party as a vehicle. But he's not someone who is rethinking the Republican agenda. Others in the party are trying to do that at this time. But it's hard when Trump's personality is so omnipresent and powerful. And a lot of Republicans, as we show, from McConnell to Speaker Ryan and others, have had a transactional bond. I remember covering Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012. And in November and December of 2012, I had a dinner with some of my Republican sources, top strategists in the country. And Romney had just been defeated. And they said to me then, Costa, it's over for us. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, these places are gone. The working class, they don't buy us anymore. If Romney can't win, who knows? We're going to have to go way to the center. way to the center. We start winning over Latino voters, and we're going to have to change on immigration. You remember Reince Priebus had that whole autopsy for the GOP. And they really believed that the party was effectively finished in terms of presidential campaigns, because they didn't see the coalition out there. The working class voters had gone away, and the country was changing too fast culturally and demographically to keep up. But yet Trump comes in 2011, 2012 with birtherism. Then in 2013, remember the major immigration debate. And by 2014, Trump's making a searing argument to the working class that immigration is the issue. They're trying to bring too many legal immigrants into this country, letting too many illegal, undocumented workers in, and immigration was the thing he grabbed onto, along with the racially incendiary birtherism campaign that he had started in 2011. And the Republican Party, at some levels was appalled, but in so many ways welcomed him in. And in exchange for welcoming him in, they won the presidency. They were able to nominate Supreme Court justices and confirm Supreme Court justices. They were able to enact a tax cut, many other policies, but it comes at a cost, and that's a reporter's assessment. It comes at a major cost. You win transactional political gains, but you also, in terms of the party's identity and future, are complicated by being now intertwined with this personality.
And that's what I'm kind of curious about. I mean, many Republican leaders made that bet in 2016 that, okay, so Trump wasn't their ideal candidate, but he had people behind him, he had a movement behind him. They decided to take a bet with him for 4 years. And yes, they got some policy victories, but as your book lays out, they were also in extreme danger to a certain extent of starting something much larger. And you also document how difficult it was for party leaders like Mitch McConnell to work with Trump, how much he had to cajole him. I mean, Paul Ryan, you detail him going to the White House to tell Trump to sign a bill to keep the government open that Republicans have passed. Like, that should have been a no-brainer, and yet it was something they needed to cajole Trump to do. So I'm wondering if Republican Party leaders are going to then take the same bet in 2024. If Trump runs, if he has that same momentum behind him, are party leaders going to say, okay, he's better than any Democrat out there? Or are they going to say, nope, we remember the 4 years between 2016, 2020, and we really can't have something like that again?
Well, the question is going to be, who are the party leaders at that time? Think about Paul Ryan, who you just mentioned. When he comes in as House Speaker after Boehner, he thinks this is going to be a normal period in American politics. Then Trump's elected in 2016, and Ryan had broken with Trump after Access Hollywood was broken by the Washington Post. And we revealed for the first time, Ryan is studying psychiatric manuals on narcissistic personality disorder. Studying them. A wealthy donor in New York sends psychiatric articles, and the Speaker of the House is reading articles on a psychiatrist's handbook about narcissism to understand the president-elect. That's where this country was. And what happens to Ryan? The Ryan story, how does it end in Peril, at least? It's still maybe ongoing. Ryan decides to leave Congress at a young age. And Mitch McConnell says to Ryan comes in to say hello to Ryan. Ryan comes to McConnell to announce his resignation, his decision to resign, and leave, not to resign, to not run for re-election, to leave Congress. And McConnell says to him in the book, in the scene, I can't believe you're leaving the playing field. It's really a shame you're leaving the playing field. But Ryan decided to leave at a young age because he had just had it to hear. He had had enough. Whether it was convincing the president to fund the government or to convince the president to keep off his comments on Charlottesville, Ryan decided to leave. And when Ryan's watching the events on January 6th, our book shows, he starts to bawl. It has an emotional, visceral reaction. And I'm not here to make any conclusions of what drew that or what it's about, but he wept as he watched January 6th. But to me, the takeaway is he left, right? So to answer your question, Ryan leaves. Who stays? Kevin McCarthy stays. He's there. And even after January 6th, our book shows him going down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Trump, to give Trump the respect of a meeting. And it's a funny scene, actually. They're both eating hamburgers, and McCarthy says, I don't want a bun. I'm trying to lose weight. We're all going through the pandemic. I know what it's like trying to avoid the buns myself from time to time. But McCarthy and Trump are having this friendly meeting, and it's not just about the hamburger in the scene. It's about McCarthy's working with Trump. And so to answer your question, a lot of people who are there now accept that Trump's a force, and they're not going to necessarily battle it.
It's kind of like in your book how, Attorney General Bill Barr, he decides to leave. A number of people around Trump who are trying to influence him decide
Barr
to
leaves
leave,
in December of 2020.
The people who come in are the ones who are the yes men, the ones who are willing to support his narrative, even though there's, as we can see, not a lot of evidence to back up the fact that there was widespread fraud. I do want to turn to a couple of questions that the audience has submitted. Just a reminder, if you have others that you'd like to send in, email those to headliners@press.org with the subject line Costa. We have one from Noel Rubinton, which is, if you could ask Donald Trump one more question and he had to answer honestly, take a minute to let you, what would your question be?
That's a great question. I know exactly what I would ask President Trump. President Trump, in almost every interview now, constantly talks about one thing, that he believes the election was stolen. And we did not get an interview with President Trump for this book, and we welcome more input from all sources at all times. And so we were disappointed about that. But if I had a chance to ask him only one question, I would ask him for one thing. Mr. Trump, President Trump, I would like to see your phone logs from January 5th and January 6th, 2021. Here's why. Having covered President Trump for a long time, I know that when he's doing a television interview, he's in the persona of Donald Trump. You know how he sits on the chair like this, the whole thing. When he's on the phone with these interviews, he often is more candid. And that's revealing about how he operates in private. Lawmakers have told me Trump does not use email. He only talks on the phone. And everything he does is on the phone, whether it's talking to Giuliani or Bannon or Pence. Yes, there are sometimes Oval Office meetings, but he's a telephone operator. He operates on the telephone. And so I really want to not hear his spin if I had one question only. I'd want to know, what did he do? So much of reporting is not just about what people's opinions are of a certain event, but what did they actually do and who did they talk to? And so much of what we do in Peril, Woodward said we got to get the scene. Who was saying what to whom when? And the phone logs would really help us further understand who was Trump talking to as the pressure campaign hit its peak on January 5th and January 6th ahead of the insurrection, because we don't know that full story.
So do you think that's something the January 6th Commission for Congress could potentially look at?
It's for them to decide. Executive privilege is always going to be a challenge for the January 6th Commission, but if President Trump is watching this and wants to share his logs, he knows how to reach me.
We have another question from, and I'm so sorry, I might slaughter this name a little bit, Michaela Bibliovici? Apologies about that, Michaela. But if you were to, it's a great question though, if you were to compare the damage to society done by Watergate versus the damage to society by the Trump administration, what would be some striking similarities and some striking differences between the two? Which one is worse in terms of long-term damage?
Well, Woodward and I what a joy to work with Woodward, who has been on the beat for 50 years. And we've talked about the comparisons between Watergate and now. And Watergate was different because you had a criminal conspiracy within the presidency that was revealed on tape, that the tapes were so critical to Watergate in addition to the reporting. The main difference, though, between Watergate and now, as we've discussed, Woodward and I, over the past year, is that in 1974, there are some similarities in the sense that you have a collapse of a presidency. In the final days, Woodward's book with Carl Bernstein in 1976, one of the most vivid scenes is Nixon talking to the paintings on the walls of the White House, former presidents. He's collapsed as president, and he's talking to the pictures on the wall. And in our book, we have Trump opening the door to a freezing night on January 5th and talking to the mob outside on the streets of Pennsylvania Avenue. They have courage. Do you hear them? Mr. President, do you want us to close the door? No, keep the door open. I want to hear my people. They have courage. That was the scene on January 5th, late at night, after Pence had left the White House. But the difference between Watergate and now is in August of 1974, Barry Goldwater went to the White House along with some other Republicans and said to Nixon, if you're impeached in the House, which looked very likely at the time, he was about to be impeached, and this goes to a Senate trial, I believe this was the line from the book, you're going to have 5 votes in the Senate among Republicans, and one of those votes is not mine. That was the titan of conservatism talking to Nixon in 1974, and Nixon soon after resigns. When you've lost Goldwater, and you've lost the conservatives, you've lost the Republicans. The Republicans never broke with Trump. Think about the trial in February of this year. No, they did not try to convict Trump. The other difference is in 1974...
Can I stop you there for a second? Why? Why do you think Republicans didn't? Because there were concerns. There were Republicans who voted for that second impeachment. And as you detail in your book, there were senators like Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Mike Lee, who had some serious concerns about the allegations that Trump were making and who investigated and realized on their own that this was not accurate, that there wasn't widespread fraud, that Biden had truly won the election. Why didn't they have sort of the same moment, and why didn't the same sort of effect occur?
Well, history will be the judge in many respects. I mean, think about McConnell. There's no one our book shows who despises President Trump more inside of the Republican Party than McConnell. Yet McConnell does not vote to convict Trump in the second trial. Why? His argument, it was a pretty passionate speech from McConnell. He said, because Trump is out of office, I'm not going to convict someone in a Senate trial if they're out of office. And that ultimately became the bedrock of many Republicans as they made the case for why they didn't want to convict Trump. But based on my own conversations for the course of the reporting of this book, it's clear so many Republicans just did not want to poke the bear in terms of poking Donald Trump. They may need his endorsement, support for 2022 or 2024, and they didn't want to further fight. And so you saw so few Republicans wanting to get engaged. But one quick thing on Watergate, Woodward and I have often discussed how Nixon gets on the helicopter in '74 and goes away, goes back to San Clemente in California, and works on rehabilitating himself for history, writes all these books, In the Arena, all these other history books, but he doesn't run again. Nixon goes away in many respects. He does the Frost-Nixon interviews, but he doesn't try to run in 1976. So Trump, though, is not going away. His people, his movement, not going away. That's the big difference between now and Watergate.
I also wanted to ask a little bit, because the scenes with him are so detailed and the pressure he was under is so well articulated about the future for former Vice President Mike Pence. I mean, this is a man who you state in your book has literally tied his political future to Trump, has been loyal to him for 4 years publicly, and then at the very last minute, and I think Bob Woodward mentioned this in an interview, he could have stood up on January 6th.
Would have been a constitutional crisis, no doubt about it.
He could have done that, and he decided not to under immense political pressure. I'm wondering why you think he did what he did, number one, and number two, what his political future looks like. Is there any sort of spot with him now within the political landscape?
Well, I've long covered Trump. There's actually probably no politician I've covered more closely in my career than Mike Pence, strangely enough, but it's true. In 2010, I started covering the House of Representatives, and I was focused on House Republicans. And there was one congressman at the time from Indiana named Mike Pence, who would often hang in that area outside of the House of Representatives on the second floor of the chamber. There's an area called the Speaker's Lobby where reporters can hang out and grab quotes and pull people aside. And I got to know Mike Pence, the congressman from Indiana. And to be candid, he wasn't approached by many reporters. He was a low-key congressman from Indiana. He was not a high flyer. And sometimes I would talk to him, and he would often tell me that back in Indiana, he used to be a talk radio host. And I said, oh, how did that go? He would say, Bob, they called me Rush Limbaugh on decaf. And these are the kind of conversations you have with people when you're a reporter covering the Capitol, and he's kind of a backbencher. He was in leadership briefly, but he was a conservative on Capitol Hill, and it just wasn't part of the beating heart of Congress back 10 years ago. The Tea Party was on the rise, and Pence was considered an outsider to maybe run as a House member for president in 2012, but nothing happened. Ultimately decides to run for governor of Indiana in 2012. The long story short, the reason I mention this, I knew Pence years ago, and this was a guy who had started running for Congress back in 1990, lost, and didn't win a seat till 10 years later, and was a talk radio conservative, inspired by Reagan, Gingrich, rank and file, Midwestern, Indiana, conservative Christian Republican. That's Pence. And he was also someone who was always adaptable. And I noticed this too. When the Tea Party started to get traction, Pence, who was close to the Bush administration in some respects, adapts. He becomes kind of a Tea Party Republican. And when he goes to Indiana, the party's changing, he remains adaptable. And so why did he do what he did? For 4 years, he always did what President Trump wanted. But that history of Pence as a conservative did inform him and maybe even prevented him from doing something that could have caused a constitutional crisis. His lawyers, who are unknown publicly, people like Greg Jacob, his advisors like Mark Short, kept telling him, you have nothing else to do but count the votes on the 6th. And there were other people, just like I said earlier, power is often wielded on the outside. We were the first to report the conversation of Dan Quayle, the former Indiana Republican vice president, talking to Pence and saying, just count the votes, Mike. There's nothing you can do. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. There's nothing you can do, Mike, except count the votes. And President Trump did everything possible. And this, to me, is the real story of January 6th. The testing of democracy through the testing of Mike Pence. If Mike Pence and Mike Lee in the Senate and others buy into the Eastman argument, and on January 6th say we should throw out millions of votes by throwing away electors and throwing the election to the House of Representatives, it would have been a democratic crisis unlike anything we've seen since the years of Jackson, the early part of this country. And you also, even if it doesn't go to the House, if Pence is vice president and president of the Senate, even just walks away, think about the effect that has on American democracy to not give Biden the legitimacy and credibility he needs to have a presidency, to have a successful presidency. And Pence ultimately decides to hold his ground, but it was a winding path. He wanted to do what President Trump wanted. Ultimately, he had guardrails inside his own inner circle, inside his own mind, it seemed, inside the party. But like so much of what this book captures, and life, we're all making decisions as human beings. There's no real final determination on anything until a decision is made. And Pence doesn't make that decision ultimately until January 6th in the morning when he issues that letter. And think about that scene on January 5th. It still gives me a little chill. When Pence is one-on-one in the Oval Office with Trump. The day prior, Eastman and Trump had been in the Oval Office together. Listen to John. Now it's the time to close the deal on the 5th. And Trump says, wouldn't it be cool if they gave you the power? If that mob outside said you had the power? Wouldn't it be cool if you had it? If you could decertify an election? It's the temptation of power for someone who wants the presidency. Mike Pence wants to be president one day. To have that in front of you is such a tantalizing prospect. It will be a counterfactual for the rest of history of what would have happened if Pence had gone the other way.
Do you think that Pence going the way that he did is in some ways his vote that one day the Republican Party will move away from Trump and will get over the idea that the 2020 election was
I don't like to read too much into Pence's political future. Think about the scene that has gotten almost no attention, but to me is so revealing of Pence. January 13, 2021, Pence brings his chiefs of staff into the West Wing for a final meeting 7 days before Biden becomes president. And they're saying, boss, this is absurd how you've been treated. Trump didn't call you when you're at the Capitol. You're being treated like dirt. You can't listen to Jared Kushner. You can't trust anyone inside. And what does Pence do in this meeting? Hey, I want to help out Trump. I want to help out Jared. Let's have a nice goodbye. He doesn't share the anger of his own confidants. Pence still, at the end, after January 6th, doesn't take the call from Pelosi and Schumer about the 25th Amendment, ignores the call the day after. And then on January 13th, doesn't want to listen to his advisors when they urge him to take a tougher line privately on Trump. He wants to make it work. And you see even now in his public speeches, he's not walking away from Trump. Neither is the Republican Party. Why? As Mike Pence's example seems to show, they all see the Trump movement and the Trump voter as something that will continue even if Trump fades away.
Bob, we're very close to the end of our program today. I have to get in a few quick messages to everyone, and then I want to wrap up with one final question. First of all, I just need to acknowledge and thank the organizers of today's event. I'm just the one up here asking questions. It took a lot of other people to make this happen. Headliners, co-team leaders, Donna Lewan-Legere and Lori Russo, thank you guys. Today's headliner, event coordinators, club membership director, Kate Helster, who's amazing, club executive director, Bill McCarran, who's also awesome, headliners team member, Ellen Ferguson, who I used to personally work with, so I can, once again, awesome, and the team at the Press Club's Broadcast Center. Thank you all so much. I also just want to give everyone a heads up to please join us Wednesday, October 13th at 10 a.m. when we'll hear from AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler, the first woman to lead the Labor Federation in its 135-year history. Also, just a heads up, if you want to purchase the book Peril, which you absolutely, I don't know how you wouldn't want to purchase it now after that. You can still do so. It's just outside the door to this room, and Bob has been gracious enough to stick around for a little while and sign copies. One last final question, if I may. We are the Press Club. We are a group of journalists and communicators, so I'm going to take a minute to ask this question. What was it like to work with Bob Woodward?
Bob Woodward is a journalism icon, as he should be. He and Carl Bernstein set the standard for how to report on a presidency when they covered Nixon, and to this day, Woodward, with his reporting on the presidency, has done that for so many books. Carl Bernstein remains someone I'm inspired by and respect. Working with Woodward is like getting a PhD in reporting. You really understand that at the end of the day, there's no substitute for hard work. Bob Woodward, 78 years old, is tougher and harder working than almost anyone I've ever met. And he kept me going to go back. And he would always tell me, ask further questions, get more people to talk to you in person. Sometimes he would say, get off your rear end and go knock on someone's door. Really go to the story. Just like he did with Watergate and has done so many times since then. Go to the story. I've been a daily reporter at the Washington Post for about 7-8 years, and I have such respect for daily reporters. To hit that deadline every day is not easy for the next day's paper. But to have an opportunity to step back for 9 months and to work with Bob Woodward and to really understand the method of long-form investigative reporting was an invaluable professional and personal experience. And I have to say, having worked with him up close, you would think that there would be some kind of secret sauce for how Woodward does it. There's not. He just keeps working and studying the transcripts and notes he gets, asking people for more documents, emails, text messages, transcripts, diaries, always pushing people for more. And the thing I most respect about Woodward is that whether it's from left or right or center, he keeps his cool and he keeps his eye on the prize, which is the truth. And as long as you stay cool and focus on that, it's hard not to succeed. And so I will always appreciate him for being my guide and a constant reminder of how to do things right. Thank you.
Bob Costa, we look forward to many other great stories for you. We hope to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here. Appreciate you all coming.
We hope to have you back in the future. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. It's so wonderful to see a crowd of people back at the Press Club. Looking forward to many, many more. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Thanks for coming and taking the